Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Allen-Storey, and welcome to the Frontline Club series, Looking at the Still Image. This series of talks is broadcast the first Thursday of every month. The program features the influence and impact of the still photograph, including themes from looking at the DNA of iconic imagery, artistic trends, things about humor, the influence of minorities, the impact of photojournalism, technology, festivals, and the fine art photographic market, with international panelists representing curators, gallerists, agencies, auction house, publishers, and photographers. Today's talk features photojournalism and the liberal press. It features the collaboration of the Photographers Gallery with the Guardian Newspaper Foundation, who have created an exhibition of more than 200 images drawn from the legendary Guardian Picture Library, exploring photojournalism across the 20th century. The panels will be presenting a myriad of themes associated with the liberal press, from feminism, post-colonialization, through to war, climate change. But we also will be looking at, importantly, how the liberal press is depicting the news into the 21st century and what has been the drivers, looking out with our crystal ball. I am delighted to introduce our very expert and interesting panel. Karen McQuaid is the senior curator at the Photographers Gallery. She contributes to texts, to photography publications, institution, and artist book, and she guest lectures throughout the United Kingdom. Luke Dogg is the Guardian and Observer Archive founder. Some of his most prominent projects include the establishment of the National Museum of the 1840s Irish Famine, several books and films relating to the work of the legendary observer photographer Jane Bond, and curating Easter Rising, 1916, a sextant collection at the Photographers Gallery. Sarah Lee started her professional career 22 years ago as a contract freelancer for The Guardian. So she's been there probably the longest that I know of all the photographers. She's still there, which is amazing. She's also one of BAFTA's regular photographers and ambassadors for Leica. Her book, West of West, loosely focusing on the end of Route 66 in California, was recently published by Unbound in early 2020. She's the 3 times finalist at the Taylor Welling Portrait Prize at the National Portrait Gallery, and recently was one of the exhibitors in the NGP Hold Still exhibition during the lockdown. I'd like to kick off the talk this evening with Karen, who curated with Luke to create this stunning exhibition, who'll give us a glimpse of the show. There you go, Karen, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to really introduce you to the show itself at the gallery, letting you know that there's still time to go see it. If you're UK based or London based, it's on until the 26th of September. I was lucky enough to work closely with Luke on this. And I'll just take you around the space a little bit. The gallery, obviously we've been going since 1971. It's quite interesting to think that photojournalism had a kind of really strong founding place in the gallery. Our founding director, Sue Davies, actually got a lot of practical support from Fleet Street when she was opening the gallery. So Sir Tom Hopkinson and Harold Evans were very big supporters when she was trying to kind of generate the energy to begin the gallery as a project. And indeed the first show, which was The Concerned Photographer, was all focused on photojournalism. The Guardian, we became aware that it was the Guardian's 200th year, and it's actually the gallery's 50th birthday. So we thought it would be a really appropriate time to kind of look in this moment maybe where trust and mistrust in the media are really kind of being interrogated in lots of different ways, that it might be an interesting time to invite somebody in, like Luke, who has a lot of inside knowledge of this particular archive, and to come up with the idea for a show. So Luke and I worked quite closely together on how to go through. I mean, there's more than, I mean, Luke will tell you more, but there's more than, you know, it's an enormous archive that he trawled through on our behalf in order to kind of bring this show together. In the very front space of the gallery, you have what I would kind of call almost like a distillation of themes, because The Guardian's obviously a paper with a certain liberal position and a liberal stance. Certain themes come up again and again over the decades. So whether that be immigration or women entering kind of male-dominated spaces, or the UK and Europe's relationship with each other, certain things come up decade after decade. So we chose to make this kind of space in the front where you orientate yourself and really get a little bit more information about those sorts of themes and start sort of some thoughts ticking over. And then we bring you into the backspace, which is much more free flowing. We decided early on that we were going to kind of ignore thematics there, ignore chronology, and really allow the images to sit beside each other across decades and across themes. We chose to not frame the work for the majority of the show. We chose to build this kind of shelving, bespoke shelving unit that goes around the majority of the space. And part of the reason for that was because we wanted to allow the marks of the kind of workings of the library to be very visible. So a lot of these, you know, these are plastic objects. They are physical things that were handed around a newsroom, and they bear the markings of that. So whether that be hand painted highlights or crop marks, all of that kind of layered information of the kind of the editors and the picture editors and the art workers' hand are still, you're still able to see them, and maybe a lot better than if we'd have put them in formal frames behind window mounts. We were also lucky enough to commission Nesreen Malik to write an essay, kind of a framing essay, so to speak, on the show. So do go to the website and have a look at that. Luke's also giving a talk next on the 15th of September. If anyone's a bit more interested, there's more stuff there. And this is just a little range of some images from the show to give you the type, give you an idea really of the scope of imagery that we had. And I mean, that might be enough for me to introduce, and I might hand over to Luke just as I whiz through these.
Thank you for that, Karen. Before you pick up, Luke, I think what's fascinating about this show is the way it was curated by both of you, and the idea of it, as you rightly say, Karen, it's not behind frames being precious. It's sort of in your face, as it was probably being published at the time. And it was not being published in a frame. It was being published in a paper for the wider public to read. And that is a masterful kind of a difference of looking at photography rather than saying traditional manner and so on. So Luke, it's over to you. And if you'd be kind enough to also just give us a wee bit of a background of it's a massive job to be able to pull together a legacy of all that work, to go through quadrillions, I don't know how many contact sheets and pictures you had to go through to curate and put together this odyssey, is the only way I can say. So if you give us a little bit background about of pulling this all together for the foundation, and also how you and Karen collaborated to create this amazing exhibition.
Well, in one sense, it was an ideal lockdown project because I spent months in a cold archive store in the basement at King's Cross of the headquarters, and literally going through the box after box. And just to give some context, as Karen mentioned, it's the 200th anniversary of The Guardian, but clearly the first use of photography is in the first decade of the 20th century. And basically this show kind of straddles the 20th century and ends just before Sarah joins The Guardian. So it was a working library, obviously started in Manchester because that's where The Guardian has its origins, and very kind of idiosyncratic. And I suppose really until the 1960s, photographs were used very sparingly by the paper. You know, it's very text heavy, and photographs, and you know, even until fairly recent times, were regarded as purely illustrative of the text that accompanied it. You know, there was a kind of a secondary status. So the way in which the photo library, the working picture library, was managed was two overarching categories, one for people and one for subjects. And basically, as work was commissioned or bought in from wire agencies, a new file was created. So it tended to be very idiosyncratic, very much based on the knowledge of the librarian. You know, the way it worked was if somebody wanted a picture of Samuel Beckett, they would phone the picture desk, the file would be brought up, and then they would select one or not, you know, that was there. And it was a kind of fairly sedate thing up until the 1960s, when with the, you know, introduction of the 35mm camera and suddenly color supplements and printing in color, it became a very different animal altogether. However, the way in which the picture library was managed continued more or less in the same way. the library from Manchester was eventually transferred to London when the paper moved there, and interestingly not integrated with the other library that existed in London. So it was, there's a very discreet, and it's extremely strong, that very early stuff, and there's a good deal of it in the show. So the two libraries basically sat side by side, growing exponentially. And then obviously by the middle of the 1990s, with the advent of digital technology, it became increasingly redundant because there was a far greater appetite for new stuff, commissioning stuff. So in about 2000, the transfer of the working picture library happened into the archive, where it was properly catalogued and boxed up and preserved, and as you say, it's about 100,000 individual files. So there's easily 1 million photographs. I mean, nobody's ever counted it because some files have 5, some have 50. And there's vast amounts of it that is fairly uninteresting. It's, a largely very Anglo-centric collection. There are huge amounts, that every city in England has a file, burgeoning with, there's vast amounts of sports stuff. It was
there for a second. So, you're usually saying there's maybe 1 million images and so on. I recently had a lunch with Fiona Shields, and I was asking her, given that we have a global reach with the digi world, I said, give me an idea about how many images are sent to you on a daily basis. She said, it will blow your head off. And it's the thousands, 70, 80,000 pictures a day can be sent in, especially when there's a crisis somewhere. And the citizens' kind of ability to be able to send anything in. So can you imagine managing that? And then we talk about 100 years at the Guardian of a million and chronicling that and so on. I don't know what the next 100 years is going to look like. Can you help me with that?
Well, I can't. But I suppose the other thing to say is it was obvious in going through the stuff laboriously that, the great strengths of the collection are the kind of things that the Guardian as a liberal newspaper is known for: strikes, demonstrations, social issues, feminism. That's where the real sort of gold in the collection is. And much of the stuff that's on display, or not much of it, but certainly at least 20% of it, never made it into the paper. They were, so it's been a mixture of stuff, very familiar images and also fairly obscure ones. And I suppose the big thing that emerged out of putting it together with Karen is the business of what does it mean, to take a photograph for a liberal paper? How is that different to a more conservative broadsheet? And basically, if you sort of go into the show, I think you can see how, Walter Doughty, the first photographer, went to Dublin to cover the Civil War in the 1920s and staged lots of photographs. That was entirely appropriate then. That's how it was done. That would be completely wrong now. Also in the same way that, I suppose now one of the things that's happening is there are more and more photographers from, particularly, sort of situations abroad, from within Indigenous communities being encouraged to take photographs rather than sending the sort of, the kind of Western liberal view, and kind of all the difficulties around that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, just to add to that a tiny bit as well, it's also the very idea of what is liberal changes over time. There's language used in the 70s that would be seen as completely impolitically correct now. So the idea that actually the relationship between text and image and how that changes over time, and how much of that idea of what exactly is a liberal view and how much that shifts with society is also kind of, you're able to extrapolate those sorts of things when you watch the language changing as well as the images.
And then working with Karen too, we split the show into two. There's a front room where I think we showed how the context for some of the images has changed fairly radically since they were taken. So we've given the context that was on the back of the image. why it was commissioned, what it illustrated, and then we've given much more context to bring it into line with, obvious things like feminism and post-colonialism and the kind of debates that I suppose were churned up in Britain over the last 10 years, particularly, focused by Brexit.
Can I ask you a question for all three of you, really? And the major categories of which you said the liberal press in the early days and hopefully into today of what is being focused on, whether maybe not so much post-colonialism, but certainly feminism and Black Lives Matter and so on. Do you think, looking at what is in the archive now, are there some images that you all look at now and said that triggered change for the good, or it had a massive impact on the public's mindset to actually take action and do something about it? Are there any images that come to mind that are in the show?
Well, there's a set from South Africa, which were put in specifically to address this, because, and this is a case, a vitrine, where we deal with basically the sort of imaging by Western liberal whites of, people of color. And it shows that the South African pictures show abuses on a farm, farms, several farms in South Africa in apartheid era. And this was a campaign run by The Guardian. Interestingly, the photographer is not acknowledged because presumably there was somebody who would get into trouble for taking the images. And because of that campaign and because of the very graphic images, a parliamentary commission was set up and conditions for workers on those farms improved. And then conversely, we have a wonderful neoliberal image of a man in Harlem in the 1960s. We don't know his name. He's sort of leaning against a truck. But, there are kind of racial overtones in that, a faceless Black man on a street who looks like a kind of hobo. And we contrast that with another image taken 10 years later in Brixton, almost an identical image of another man leaning across a vehicle. And these were images that were used over and over again in the paper to illustrate completely different stories. And again, that's the kind of thing that would no longer be tolerated by Fiona or the other picture editors. That was appropriate at the time, and now we understand, because of debates, that shouldn't happen. Faceless, nameless people just being used to illustrate whatever.
So showing more respect for the sitter is what you're saying, and integrity. But the question I was really looking to probe, I guess because I'm thinking of one picture that, I remember, many, many years ago during the Vietnam War, when the picture that Nick Ut took of the gal that was running away from the napalm being burned by it. And that was run as the front cover of Life magazine, which was a family magazine in the United States. And from what I understand, he never told the publisher he was going to do it because he knew he'd be in deep doo-doo to actually run a naked pubescent girl on the cover of Life magazine. But that certainly was a dynamic stimulus and a trigger that many, many people protested against why America was in the war at the time. Yes, Sarah.
I was just thinking, one that springs to mind, and I've just had to look up because I'm not sure how you pronounce the photographer's name, of the Greek fires. There was a picture very recent. It wasn't commissioned by The Guardian. It was taken by Konstantinos Kalidis. I have pronounced his surname incorrectly. But it's the woman, an elderly woman running from a fire. It brings Nick Ut's picture to mind. And she's clutching at her chest, and the landscape is a wall of flame and devastation behind her. And I think, given the still image doesn't necessarily, there's such a proliferation, as you said, Fiona and The Guardian picture editors see, tens of thousands of pictures a day. But that was an image I thought that jumped out very recently in the last couple of weeks and summed up the climate crisis and the feelings. And it did what a moving image can't. And that's what obviously still photography in a liberal paper or any paper does. Ideally, it just encapsulates everything into an image that goes straight to an emotional reaction and a political reaction. And anyway, sorry, that was the one that jumped to mind very recently that did that.
Excellent.
And I think,
Interestingly, kind of on that theme in a way, if you think also about, say, the photograph that was taken on the first kind of one of the Apollo missions, the very famous one of the blue and green globe, you know, there is a lot of discussion that was, you know, when you look at the beginnings of Greenpeace and the beginnings of a kind of an environmental awareness, that actually that photograph of the Earth from that perspective was also, so, you know, leading us to where we are now with climate change, or, you know, so it's yeah, there's lots of possibility.
But let's look at some pictures. Lou, do you want to take us through with Karen some of the images?
No, well, we've gone through ours, so I think it's over to Sarah if, yeah. Or unless Luke wants to talk in more detailed way about the ones we...
Well, we can come back to that, but I think, I mean, like I said at the beginning, the show sort of ends around the year 2000, which is more or less around the time that Sarah started. So it's kind of, you know, and you probably are well aware of how, you know, the dark rooms worked, you know, and I don't know if I came in right at the tail end of that when there were still technicians, but all of that's gone. So you operate in a completely different world now.
yeah, I mean, firstly, very quickly, I feel slightly a fraud because I haven't. I've been working for 22 years and I do very little issue-based photojournalism, but my entire career from the first picture I was ever commissioned to take has been for The Guardian. So in that sense, I'm not a fraud in this conversation. And I began in 1999, completely fresh from college, and I didn't study photography, but I took a portrait of Iris Murdoch that caught Eamon McCabe's eye, and absolutely on a whim. And I think pertinently, they had no women photographers apart from Jane Bown at the Observer, but they were more separate entities, the same building, but very distinct identities in a way that has slightly merged now. And they didn't have anyone young. And at the time I was 22. So, and I started, and it was film, and it was so different now. I remember pictures, as you said, those folders of pictures would come up at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon from the picture library, had moved to London. I would shoot 2 or 3 jobs in a day, which has changed quite a lot now, on maybe 2 rolls of film, because then you would have to scan it. And what we would do is take it to a scanning technician, many of whom had been trained in Photoshop, but had previously worked in the darkroom. And I mean, I still make younger photographers go, what are you talking about? And I say, I've got to go home and scan my images, but I mean, edit. But it was just the word was, you know, that you would have to sit there at the end of the day and get your 3 jobs scanned in, you know, and you would only have, say, the technicians would let you choose an edit of maybe 4 or 5 frames from a job. And that had to be, whereas now a photographer would submit vast amounts more. So in my career, it changed to digital a couple of years later, which was terrible quality to start with. Now I would say nearly everything I shoot is on digital, apart from some of my personal work. But in that time, since 2000, it's coincided with what, you know, I went to the James Barner exhibition the other day, and a photographer stopped me. He didn't know I was a photographer and was telling me how photography is dead. This was a golden age, James Barner, and it was over. And I disagreed with him, but it has changed. I mean, my career sort of a couple of years in was at the point when suddenly it was harder to get paid. There were no staff positions. I started and there were 6 Guardian staff photographers when I started, and now there's 2. It's sort of 1.5 almost. One's on a sort of smaller staff contract. And most of the photographers who work regularly with the paper are in the position that I'm in. I'm a contract freelancer. So I've been there 22 years and I don't actually have a job per se, but it sort of feels like a job because it's such a long connection.
Can you show us some of our pictures? I think our audience would love to see.
It is, I don't have control to show them. So someone else was going to show them, I think. I don't know how to bring them up on screen. So,
and Vera, who is the guru on all of it. Pan?
And if you don't mind me talking whilst I think,
talk over the pictures.
Yeah, so this is that's from the Harry and Meghan wedding. And I think where my career is, to be a Guardian photographer now, you also have to make that work for you. So there's a handful of us and we're all quite different, but there's a diversification. when I started, Guardian photographers were Guardian photographers for life almost. It was a job until retirement and a well-paid pension, which isn't the case now. So I work for the Guardian, but I also do other work, and which feeds back into being a Guardian photographer. So this is the royal wedding. I like to shoot sort of sorry, forgive me, waffling. That's another difference from what Luke was saying. Online is now where a lot of my images get shown, and Fiona Shields, current head of photography, is very much a kind of champion of the online photo essay, and which is a great showcase for work now. So I don't know if you want to flick through the images, I'll kind of talk.
We must look at the images.
This was taken in the lockdown in its Scottish fans in the recent Euro Cup, and I think it's quite a Guardian image actually, but it's also, I mean, I don't do much photojournalism, but it does feel like photojournalism. They were brilliant, maddened Scottish fans, although I did feel like I was in a cloud of COVID. I came home and I smelled tenants.
No, but no one's wearing a mask, I've noticed.
No, they were, and it turns out everyone did have COVID. This was from the BAFTAs, that's another example of, say, how being a Guardian photographer works, in that BAFTA approached me separate to the Guardian because they like my work, and they've invited me. I'm only there by invitation each year, but I've been doing it for 7 years to do a sort of behind the scenes series of reportage of all the award ceremonies, which is, I like arts and portraiture, so it's my idea of heaven. But then with BAFTA, I've arranged that the Guardian gets exclusive access to the pictures, and they tend to run them in a photo essay the day after I've shot them. So this is Michaela Cole from this year. And that sort of, it's very different from how it would have worked, the commissioning process that Luke was talking about with Karen in the 20th century. But now, I think being a Guardian photographer and photography at the Guardian is about creating an identity that's recognizably the Guardian, using photographers that it has a relationship with. And we are encouraged to go out and, A, if you're a photojournalist, come up with your own stories, but B, even if, like me, I'm an arts portrait photographer, to come back with things, to have a kind of a relationship that benefits the paper. It's an identity that's associated with the paper, but also it's much looser. And I think that's, I mean, I feel like we're still evolving and finding our feet, but that's being a sort of 21st century Guardian photographer. It's very different. This was from a project in Camden that Guardian ran, and yeah, and this is actually candid photojournalism in a sense. It's a boy on a bus. I got permission afterwards. And it also, I think it was in a competition or an award somewhere, so they ran it. Yeah, this was a Taylor Wessing picture. Actually, this was personal work. I just shot this walking through Regent's Park, but it was in the Taylor Wessing exhibition, which the Guardian then runs. And I think things like that, they encourage very much, because if, as someone who has a contract with the Guardian, regularly has my byline in the Guardian, if you're in something like the Taylor Wessing, the Guardian then runs it. It's a sort of mutual relationship, and it creates a sense of, you say, what is a liberal paper? It's about a collection. Forgive me, what does a liberal paper's photograph look like? I think all that comes down to the editing. And so someone like Fiona and the other people who work on the picture desk have a number of photographers, me, and at the moment, maybe about 8 of us who are on contract, all of whom have different styles, but collectively that creates a kind of house style. Then also they have to go through thousands of images, but they select, it's in the edit really. What is a Guardian image is in that edit and in the commission. So this was for a photo essay about Sergei Polunin backstage, which is just heaven. And Sadler's Wells invited me to do this, then the Guardian commissioned me. But again, Sadler's Wells want Guardian photographs. It's this ongoing sort of collaboration in my side of things between the arts and what is a Guardian picture. This is from my book, West of West. There's a couple of images in the slideshow. And again, I generated this work. It was published in a book. The Guardian liked it. I worked with a Guardian writer, Laura Barton, who I often work with, who started, like me, at the Guardian at the turn of the century. And we have a kind of long relationship, which has moved almost beyond the paper and then back in. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm being a bit woolly, trying to describe this sort of, again, that's the BAFTAs, that's John Boyega being photographed by a fan. This is ballet dancers, a Guardian commission of the Bolshoi backstage, but they look like Black Swan and there's about to be a murder or something, which wasn't the case. This was another Guardian photo essay, David Gilmore in Pompeii, which I was very pleased because the arts editors were very slightly reluctant to send me on that, even though I'd arranged for, I'd arranged it. It seemed a no-brainer, but it got the most hits of a photo essay that year, so I was proved right. Sorry, small-minded. This was a wonderful Guardian commission that I think is very much something they would do now. I was sent out, actually with Laura Barton was the writer with me, and this was just after Grenfell, to do a photo essay of Midsummer Night, where we walked through the city and kind of it was a heat wave. Grenfell had happened a week before. It felt like there were about to be riots. I mean, it was a very, very kind of tinderbox time. It was a heat wave and it was Midsummer Night, which is not a kind of project that I think would have happened in the 20th century of Guardian photography, but it's the sort of thing that they're very keen on now. And we went and I did a photo essay across London, and this was about 3 in the morning in North London somewhere. She's singing, not weeping. And this was a series actually on night buses and night travel in London, which Fiona encouraged. And that was after Pride. He actually has a cab written on his cheek, which I didn't realise stands for All Cops Are Bastards, which I didn't know. Someone pointed that out, but he looks so angelic. This is another Guardian. This is very much the sort of thing, actually, this is a crossover from the kind of work I started doing. This is an arts portrait where you get 20 minutes. It was Lenny Henry, and he was being interviewed, I think it's in the Groucho, in a room upstairs, a kind of blah, nothingy room, about underrepresentation of Black and minority figures in British television. And it was quite a serious interview, and he's done a PhD, and it certainly wasn't Lenny Henry, the comedian. And this is the kind of job which is really bread and butter to Guardian photographers. You get sent to try and take as striking an image as you can. You get about 20 minutes. And this was, as is often the way, I was packing up, I'd packed away my lights, and I just saw him sitting there and looking at me, and actually that was the picture. So often when you tell the subject you're finished, actually that's really when you get the best shot.
And not to put away your camera ever.
Yeah, exactly. And this was for a photo essay for the Observer Food Monthly on Friday night eating habits. And I went around the country with the writer. And this was outside a chip shop in Wigan on an extremely rainy November night. And I'm very pleased it got in the Taylor Wessing as well. But it is it's kind of soft photojournalism. But yeah, it was about eating. This is from an ongoing project, actually, about kind of youth and kind of pandemic and youth. And this is a woman who I stopped, or a young woman, she's about 19, who I stopped and asked if I could ask her a couple of questions and take her portrait, which I just did last week, but I included it in the edit because I like it. It will run in the Guardian, I'm confident. Another Guardian commission, this was for a piece about Britain's oldest surfer. And as I was taking this portrait, which I thought was quite a nice setup, an Orthodox Jewish family just walked out of the dunes on a deserted Cornish beach and had this sort of what looks like a small psychodrama in front of me. And that was the frame. That was unbelievable, actually. It was a kind of a joy. And then that was the sort of centerpiece of an interview and then a photo essay, which is quite often how things work now. Again, this is for Charlie Gilmore, the writer of a book about living with his magpie, and that was him and his wife and the magpie. It was again a sort of Guardian portrait, which I'm very grateful for because the magpie then died just before the book was published, which meant I'm one of the only photographers who photographed the magpie, so it had good syndication value, this picture. Another Guardian portrait. Glenda Jackson, it was taken, and it's often the way, in the corner of a very unphotogenic bar at the Old Vic, which I dread trying to make a portrait out of, but that was her sitting by the window, but I don't think you can go wrong with Glenda Jackson's face. So. And that was the picture that got me my job and turned me into a photographer. I took this as a student. and I was working as a researcher on Iris Murdoch's biography. And I showed it to Eamon McCabe because I came second in the Guardian Student Media Photo Awards. Ed Alcock, their photographer now in Paris, came first that year. And Eamon said, do you have any other pictures? And I had this, which I hadn't entered to the competition because it hadn't been published in the student paper. And Eamon's favorite, my whole career hinges on the fact that Eamon's favorite picture he took that year was of Iris Murdoch. And he went, well, how did you get to take this? And I explained, and he said, well, why don't you start next Tuesday? And
Oh
so
my God,
that's how I got my job. And a BAFTA picture, which I love because I shoot manually on a Leica, and at 1.4 walking backwards, I got this frame and I nearly fell over, which is what Leonardo DiCaprio's laughing, or that slight look with his minders around him, is because I absolutely nearly went arse over tit trying to focus that. And I love the frame because I didn't fall, and his expression of seeing me about to fall over is what makes the picture. And forgive me, it's kind of, it's the cover of my book, but it was an image that I think is oddly a Guardian kind of image now. It's about the end of Route 66. It was a personal project. It ran connected to a Guardian writer, and yeah, it's with the fill flash. It's a style that I'm interested in, and I found that the paper now quite likes its photographers to explore certain styles of photography. It's not as bound by the traditions possibly of stylistically of certain kind of, it's not just bound by certain photojournalism traditions. It doesn't mind a bit of sort of experimentation for its photographers. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's not hard photojournalism. That's not the troubles. I'm sorry. That's
no, but you talked a lot about, and I want to open the conversation on this. I think it's really important. You talked a lot about this is a style, a brand that works well with the paper. I would love, Luke or Karen, you very quickly went through a few pictures. We really haven't looked at any of the images. And I would love for you to bring up some pictures that actually, that actually show what the style was, and let's talk about some of maybe what the pictures meant, what the impact was, and who was what was the photographer's assignment when they did this. You've got, join the National Front on that. I'm not familiar with this picture, but it's a very dramatic picture. So why don't we look at a few of those and look at the difference of stylistically what the brand of photography is today as reflected into the 21st century.
Well, I think that photograph of the sort of National Front, and you can see a very strong line between this type of street photography and what Sarah still does. It's this is much more stark because it's making the point. But the Guardian now, I suppose in Sarah's era, celebrates photography. It's been let loose from the text. I mentioned earlier on that for most of the 20th century, photographs were very subservient. Now, because of the photo galleries and the huge, the eyewitness in the middle of the paper, the Guardian celebrates photography in its own terms. So as well as still commissioning work like this, which comes from a very particular political point, it also runs, as anybody who uses a newspaper online particularly will know, endless photo essays. It's extraordinary, the diversity of stuff that Fiona and her team pull out of the hat every single day.
Sorry.
I'd really love for us to, visit some of these pictures, because our audience are very interested in, what this exhibition is all about, but we haven't really spent a bit of time going through them. So Karen and Luke, Karen, why don't you pick it up here and select some pictures and talk a little bit about it and why that picture was selected to be in the exhibition.
Sure. Another thing that I touched on really briefly earlier, you'll see it here just in the crop marks, the instructions in a way that are laid onto this document. This document that's been left in a file since 1969 has the workings of the crop visible there. So the highlights and the kind of, you know, the way that these objects were treated by hand in order to reproduce in the best possible way and to bring up the best contrast is something that we kind of really enjoyed, and they become quite surreal. I don't have it here, but there's an image of a Ron Judd exhibition at Tate, and the cropping's done in such a way to focus on the artwork to the point where a visitor in the background is their legs are completely kind of artworked out, and they become this surreal floating figure on the image when you're looking at the print rather than what was finally published in the, you know, in the newspaper.
Yeah, but look at this picture that you're showing now. Asians immigrants from Kenya and circa 1968.
I mean, just looking at an airport image today of any sort of political movement.
Let's think about Afghanistan and what the imagery looks like today of immigrants looking to escape, to find another life. If you look at the people in this particular image, they're clean, they're well dressed.
They have precious items with them, whether it's a frame or an instrument. You know, they've had the time to gather more than one small bag per family.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that comes across in this period, you know, when the beginnings of sort of immigration, you know, mass immigration into England, is how, certainly in the Guardian's case, how positive the images are and how positive the text is that accompanies them. And for whatever reasons, that all curdles very quickly. There are two images in the exhibition. Again, I'm not sure that we have them here, but this is one of the reasons why you should go. There's a wonderful image of a group of Muslim men in Manchester in, I think, the 1940s. The most wonderfully respectful image of these recent immigrants, you know, being welcomed into the country. And from 2000, there's an image of two women on a Rally for Islam march in Trafalgar Square, shown with the full sort of veil on, with just their eyes, looking very menacing. So something happened in the, you know, 60 years whereby, you know, immigration became highly political, and you know, that it's kind of easy to sort of see that in the exhibition, how, you know, that subtly things change.
I think. Oh, sorry, Sarah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that I mean, not the images I showed, but, you know, I've done my share of going on sort of slightly more newsy jobs, but you are expected, and all Guardian photographers are different. And as Luke says, we're freed from the page much more now. But I think there is a expectation on anyone who's commissioned by the Guardian, and certainly anyone who's in-house, to understand the house sensibility. And we are encouraged as a photographer. So if you went on a job and the 6 other photographers or 10 other, that used to happen more regularly 15 years ago, and at the beginning, there was certainly a Guardian angle, a Guardian eye. You were always encouraged to see it differently, not just tight, but to find a kind of a wit, as you say, be abstract sometimes. There's an expectation of both understanding a liberal sensibility, so about immigration or whatever the subject, the tone of the subject might be politically, but also as a photographer, I think certainly in the 20 years I've been there, you've always been allowed to step back, to look at it slightly differently. And on a lot of these jobs, there would be many news photographers there. And I think the person representing the Guardian, and it has that reputation, if you're in a pack of photographers and they know you're representing the Guardian, it's understood that you might be on a 24mm lens, or you might step back and get the feet of the press photographers in your frame. That is the encouragement and the expectation to see slightly a wider.
Tangential.
Yeah, if you're a Guardian photographer, and all of us are different and have our strength. I mean, Sean Smith, he always used to shoot wide at one point, wide and low, and it was very his angle, but it was a Guardian. It's quite hard to say that his shots would be very different from.
Sarah, I think you're saying something that's quite important to be thinking about, is stepping back to give the bigger picture. And maybe that's part of the DNA.
It could be that, or it could be stepping closer to have an abstraction that actually tells the story just as.
But doing both.
I think there was an expectation that you would have a different view, always as a photographer. And now you're more likely, news images, maybe that's done in the edit by Fiona and her team, because they're not often commissioned by the Guardian, they're normally coming in from the agencies, and it's that view, that Guardian view, is pulled together by the picture editors in an edit. But in work that's commissioned,
but that is their job as the
yeah,
editor.
no, exactly, but it's getting that view, whereas commissioned work, any of us, me, my colleagues, it is expected that you would have that. It is hard to define a Guardian view, and that it would not be the same as another press photographer going to do it. And that's certainly been the tradition the whole time I've been there, and obviously going back to the middle of the 20th century, I would say.
And just to throw another maybe slightly more cynical or kind of contrary idea in there also is though this idea that despite all of that, certain communities are still more often represented in a less, it's changing, of course, but when you look at the archive as a whole, sadly, despite the best efforts and the kind of, really established liberal stance that a newspaper with a heritage, as rich as the Guardian, which in fact, began in response somewhat to the Peterloo massacre, protest was there at the very nascence of the paper 200 years ago, and it has kind of perfect credentials almost in relation to liberalism, yet when you look at the archive on a whole, there is still this sense that overall, when it's accumulated, the person who is interviewed, perhaps the white middle-class man who's being spoken to or getting information from, the establishment figure, is photographed in a formal way, and yet there's entire other communities who are written about maybe more than spoken to, and there is a reflection of that in how the images work also over time. Obviously that's something that people are fighting against, but
Thinking that now, I would say in the last couple of years, that's changed.
Hang on, everybody. Hang on. I still would like us to look at some more pictures, and then we can come back to the conversation to just get a sense of the kind of brand of liberal imagery that was being featured over the last 100+ years.
Sure. So that then back to that idea of street manifestations, protest being really, really very present, agitation on the street. Kind of the activities that could happen on any street corner, but particularly sort of around protest is very, very present. And Luke was very, very certain very early on that was something that we wanted we didn't have to draw it out. It was represented so heavily within the archive, it was almost impossible not to. And then you
I think this selection of photographs gives a real sense of, the sort of strength of the collection, which is about protest and strikes, but there's also a good deal of fun in the exhibition as well. Like there's an image early on showing the development of vaccines in hens' eggs, which has seemed very appropriate at the moment. It looks shocking, that flu vaccines were being developed in the sort of yolks of eggs and being pulled out of them. There's things that just jar, like an Eartha Kitt shown in the Rhino House of Manchester Zoo, kicking her toe, you're like,
hang on guys, you're talking over. We have an image that's up, and do we have these images that we can look at?
Not all, no, I mean, unfortunately there's 200 images in the show, so I just had to pick a quick kind of selection, Carol.
Let's look at the images that we actually can look on screen that you've given.
I mean, what this is for me is a really nice example of what the show also does, and perhaps we talk about a little bit less, is also just the kind of these quiet, strange little moments that aren't necessarily attached to a big news moment, aren't necessarily attached to a historic person or event, and are kind of quite floating in their context, and quite free floating in a way, and yet have a sort of an everyday strangeness to them. And I mean,
this is an extraordinary picture. It's so graphically strong, but can you see on the underarm all the overpainting on the sort of guy whose face you can't see? His t-shirt has all been highlighted in white, as has the main man's hair, because remember the quality. I mean, the images Sarah showed are very beautiful because and they're done justice in the paper now because printing is so well. Why, Don McPhee, who worked at the paper for decades, continued day after day to take these extraordinary images. And if you see the quality of print in the newspaper, you'd wonder why, because usually they looked really muddy, or they were cropped, or, to fit 2 columns, or it really is a kind of the strength of, people's commitment to taking wonderful photographs continually is to be applauded.
I think if you're a press photographer, you just have to slightly do it for the love of it. I think I'd love to see The Guardian unpublished, that you curate from the archive entirely of pictures that have never been published before. Every photographer has. Some of the ones I showed, a couple haven't been published. The photographers, they never pick your best shot.
I think this is one of the images that Nesrine talks about in her essay. And again, and I would suggest that people read that, because she kind of comes to the conclusion that whereas The Guardian is very good on liberal causes within the confines of Britain, once it sort of steps beyond the borders, there's a kind of a colonial attitude. And this image would never be taken now, an authority white figure in the center with these black faces, and they're eating hay. I know it was to make a point about Christian aid and about famine, but it's the sort of thing that nobody would countenance any longer, for very good reasons.
Absolutely.
And this is the image from that was taken in the 70s in Brixton, and again used endlessly, 3 or 4 times, always to sort of talk about some social issue to do with sort of immigrant culture in Britain. But again, a faceless man, he's completely unidentified. And for all we know, he could be, in gainful employment, or, very successful. But it's just one of those images that gets used over and over again, informed by kind of a cultural stereotype.
Tell me, both of you, Karen and Luke, when you were putting together this show, did you have a series of images or one particular image that really captured your imagination and thought it was just so special that you kept revisiting it? Do you have any favorites in looking when you were pulling together the show?
Luke does a better answer for this question than I do.
Why?
Well, mine's just a little bit kind of a bit of a nonsense answer. There's a photograph of Kevin Keegan's grazed shoulder, which I think he fell off his bike, and some sports photographer honed in on it when he was changing his shirt at a match. But it's literally just a freckled, scarred shoulder of an almost unidentifiable man, and it's to me it's a very, very kind of strong and beautiful and strange shot. You're gonna say, I hope, the suffragette, which will give people much more context and meat than my frivolous answer.
I mean, it is. There's a great image. I mean, it's obviously one of the treasures in the collection as well. A suffragette. I mean, it's in a vintage print. Annie Kenny is her name, and she was a mill worker in Manchester. And the caption says "militant suffragette imprisoned." And I did a little bit of searching on this, and turns out that she was the only working class suffragette. I mean, she's very famous, well known about. And C.P. Scott, the famous editor at the time, kind of supported the suffragettes, but he found Annie Kenny a little difficult to take because she advocated violence. And interestingly, then I found further, digging a bit deeper, Kenny and several of the other women were force-fed, and this led in prison, and this led to one being killed because of the methods that were used. And C.P. Scott decided he wouldn't really print that because it wouldn't look well for the authorities. So it just gives you an idea of the kind of early liberal dilemmas.
Do you have a picture of that, Luke, that we can see, that you can share?
I'm afraid I don't.
Oh.
You have to go to the show.
Oh, definitely. Are you folks thinking about doing a book about this?
Well, the book was difficult, I'm afraid, because of the copyright sits with so many individual photographers that it really would be an undertaking that was certainly too big for the time that we had. I don't know, Luke, if you've any more
And also, I mean, even though it you know, in one sense, lockdown aided it, but it was impossible. I mean, it was hard enough to, I mean, thank my ex-colleagues at The Guardian for letting me in, because there was a complete embargo on anybody going into the building at the time. So I really had to plead my case and sit in a fleece in the basement, in a fridge, effectively going through file after file. So it would not have been possible to embark on a kind of publishing project at the same time because of the restrictions everywhere.
You know, just to bring this a bit more full circle, you know, we're looking now, we've gone the quantum leap from the 20th century into the 21st, and you've made a very good description, you know, although you say you're not, you think you're a fraud, you're not a fraud, Sarah, in terms of what the brand of photography and is. You know, this is a Guardian picture, this may be, I won't use other newspapers and so on. And it's their look, it's their style, and so on. But looking at the 21st century, and we're 20 years plus into it, how are you seeing the word and the example of what the liberal press is going to mean to contribute to educate the wider public, to understand what the issues are that are surrounding us, the language that is being used today for anything from, I hate to use the word because he invented it, that orange-haired person, fake news. How does a responsible liberal press now depict what's happening in the world with integrity? What are their challenges and how do we go forward?
It's up to me.
We can stop there, but I want all three of you to respond to that.
Yikes. I mean, I really am unqualified to answer that, but I think The Guardian, I mean, we haven't touched on the difference in the 20th century, as I say.
That's what I want to start with. That's exactly.
Well, for photographers, it was a job. And now The Guardian doesn't have money to invest in giving a photographer a job for life and the kind of investment. But what it does do, I think, is have this, it curates a series of photographers who are connected to that brand. And I think at the moment, in answer to something Karen was saying, in the 20 years I've been there, I mean, to start with, I was the only woman on The Guardian. And there aren't, you know, then Lyndon Ireland came along on a contract, and there aren't that many of us, but that is being righted and balanced. And in the last 3 or 4 years, also, it was entirely white. That is changing. I think there's a real recognition of the white eye and the, as you say, a kind of colonial gaze. But for example, Fiona's commissioning of Black Lives Matter, and I you know, we've all been splintered. I haven't been into the office. Luke's been in more recently than I have. I haven't been in since February 2020. So it's hard to know the conversations that are happening because I'm not witnessing them. But I noticed Anselm Abuli, a kind of Black British photographer who's young, who started on work experience. He was commissioned to cover the Black Lives Matter protests. And that, I don't think that would have happened several years ago because it would have been very in-house. But I know, and he's a brilliant photographer, and I'm really, really glad, and his work is being used more often. But I've noticed across the paper, there really is an engagement with trying to see a different eye, so that what is a Guardian photograph going forward, and that visual identity, I think, is going to become more inclusive. Personally, I mean, it's not me making these decisions, but I notice from Fiona and her team that is being engaged with, and those issues, which maybe, who knows, if there'd been I think there'd been a general complacency about race and white gaze, you know, across a lot of things. I do hope and feel a real movement for change there. But
I can give an illustration of that. Maybe about 15 years ago, there was an election in Ireland, and the newspaper the next day had a picture of 3 nuns going into a polling booth. And I went down to Roger and said, could you not get 3 leprechauns? Is there no? So I think, as you say, there is now a far greater awareness of not, and also the other good thing, and this has been in place for probably about 25 years, The Guardian has very strict guidelines about how photographs can be used in terms of cropping and no manipulation, and if an image has been altered in some way, to be absolutely explicit about it. So if you put that kind of structure in place, well then the other kind of stuff that Sarah has just talked about can then happen, you know, where greater diversity, inclusivity,
and I think
debate.
there are rules about context, which specific rules. So I know as a photographer, your thing about the nameless, you know, the guy who just represented, you know, diversity in Britain, unemployment in black communities, you know, he was just the guy. There are strict rules about context now, about children, about, but also that the picture has to reflect. I mean, you can have, as you say, these kind of lovely abstract moments that float, like that Don McPhee wrestling picture, and that's the kind of Guardian photography that I'm most interested in. My whole career, I like portraits and that sort of floating moment, and I think there is a home for that there. But where context is concerned, and I think you were saying about fake news, I think if you present a platform, I mean, I don't know how you combat, you know, identity politics and the fact that mainstream news is considered bad. I mean, God, that's beyond me, and it seems like a living nightmare. But I think the Guardian is trustworthy. It doesn't screw people over. It doesn't misrepresent. On the occasions it's made a mistake about captioning, it has a team, and not brown-nosing, who I think, particularly at the moment, take that very seriously and are really on it. So therefore, if you keep presenting truth, you know, hopefully people will rely on it as truth.
The reason I raise that as an issue, and the things that I am questioning now, and I'm sure we all are, is that given what the social media platforms are and the things that go up onto social media, there are so many voices that are being heard. And there's this questioning, do you trust traditional press? Do you trust traditional media? And we who are on the inside of it know very well the amount of fact checking and how we look at things and so on. And the concern that I'm raising up for the conversation, you know, where I've interviewed people and I said, where do you get your news? Oh, I get it on Facebook or YouTube. I said, well, what about responsible traditional press? Oh, it's fake news. They're just there to make money. And I'm just thinking of what the further challenges are to be responsible, to be able to educate and illuminate what's happening in the world objectively. How do we accommodate that?
But we have that's in a way that's also, I mean, not to blow it open too widely societally, but that's a much bigger question about education. How do we educate young people into a level of visual literacy, especially certainly in the context of the UK, where the current government might be proving again and again that they have very little interest in an educated, voting public. You know, it's almost in the power, in for a lot of people in power, it's in their best interest that people remain not educated enough. So actually, and with, you know, things like, you know, the way that the budgets are being cut for any sort of creative education, either at secondary school level or at university, you know, it's also a bigger conversation about education, because you have to have those tools to question and to interrogate, and then to be able to go and, you know, compare sources and, you know, find the sources that you trust. But that has to be, we have to start that from, you know, that's just a bigger conversation.
And I'd say again, oh, sorry, Carol, just really quickly, accountability. So if we live in a digital age, massive proliferation of images, stories, you know, but we're talking specifically about images, mistakes can happen or things can come through. I mean, I think the BBC has been in hot water about not, you know, owning mistakes. And so the Princess Diana interview, and the Guardian, I think with images, I'm thinking, I won't name names, but there was a series of images that were ran a few years ago by a young photographer who, it turned out there were things to do with plagiarism and image manipulation that wasn't owned up to. And I think the Guardian were pretty good about, you know, being upfront about that, taking the images down. I mean, I think going forward, they are pretty, mistakes happen very rarely, as far as I can see, about, you know, I think you can trust what you see in the Guardian visually. I think they have a very good team, but you have to be, I mean, it seems very clear at the moment, looking at things at the BBC or other news organisations, that if there are mistakes, they have to be, you know, owned, I think, and then learned from and move forward.
You know, I think you said something very, a bit earlier about one of the positive things looking into the 21st century, that there's more diversity of who's being represented and how they're being presented, by it being more inclusive of who is actually creating the imagery that is being depicted and shown in the papers, of having a multitude and a myriad of what is representative of what our population is all about, you know, which I think is also extremely important. I mean, how in looking, if you had a bit of a crystal ball, how do you see the evolution, looking outward, of what kind of news stories are still going to be an important integral part of the paper? How do you attract the talent that is going to understand and embrace what you talk about, of being a particular style of brand that the paper shapes?
But I think in a sense, Sarah already kind of answered this. The Guardian operates with, or consciously works at an environment in which people like Sarah are attracted to and come to, and then sort of understand what's expected of them and bring their own sort of style to it. The Guardian does what it does and has done it fairly well for a very long time. So it is, I often sort of describe it to friends, it is a bit like a university where there's a lot of discussion and sort of talk constantly about how it does what it does. And because, it's owned by a trust. There aren't a board of, shareholders shouting about profit every year. So the Guardian can afford to take a long view and get things right. And when it gets them wrong, which often happens, as Sarah says, owns it. So I think the Guardian model allows this thing to happen, and obviously the context in which it does what it does is changing hugely, but the Guardian has vast reach and is in every survey. It and the BBC are the most trusted news organizations in Britain.
Well, what's really amazing is what you said of they don't have to address shareholders' value, which is an amazing, that in itself can be an inhibitor of being able to manage it, and they're not being acquired, hopefully, by another organization that will diminish the liberal press is. If you don't have a liberal press, how can you possibly manage a democracy ever, anywhere? That's the most important thing. A liberal press, I think, is the greatest pillar of democracy, is to have that kind of freedom, to be able to publish a view on something and take a stand, which certainly the Guardian has done over all the years. The reason I was interested, do you plan a book? Because from being a historian at heart, I would love to have a historical reference point of everything that has been published and who and why it was published and what the stories were all about, and so on. Have you folks, Luke and Karen, what has been the biggest challenge you folks had in putting together this exhibition? What do you think was your greatest challenge?
Well, I mean, I think the pandemic was certainly, just it being very, very limited in access and having to, for me, having to sort of, trust doesn't come into it at all, because I worked with Luke before and I trust him completely, but having to leave him on his own in kind of a lot of the grunt work of going through the files. We could then work on a wider selection and we could talk that down, and we could, but I had to leave him, I don't like not getting my hands dirty, and I wasn't allowed to get my hands dirty in this case. So maybe that's.
I can understand that, because it's a massive collection that you've got, and all the backstories of so much of the work as well, which is so exciting.
But basically somebody else could go into that collection in the morning and make just as good an exhibition without using one of the images I picked. So it's the difficulty was I think I originally pulled out about 600 images. And we had to whittle it down. Then once Karen became heavily involved and the design was developed, we didn't want to overwhelm people with, endless images. So there's about 230 or something in the show. But like I say, anybody could have another go at it in another couple of years and have just as good an exhibition.
But can you remind me, so we can tell everyone that's been viewing it, is how long will the show be up at the Photographer's Gallery?
Yeah. Till the 26th of September. And Luke has a talk on the 15th, and also there is that really, really worthwhile essay by Nesreen's is available on our website, so have a look at that as well.
Okay, Pranvera, do we have any questions from the audience that anybody wants to ask the panelists?
Yes, we do, and it's partly answered. I'll just read it. The lady in check shirt, which I think is Sarah, used the term fraud in terms of explaining part of her experience of how she felt about being the photojournalist, and has explained her experience. So I found it interesting as I recently read Robert Capper's Slightly Out of Focus. I have to ask if he was still with us, and on this webinar, I have to wonder what he might say himself. Just amusing, I would every contributor on this webinar.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I can't really answer a question about myself and Robert Capper. I mean, then I really do feel like a fraud, drawing any, I don't know what Capper would be. I mean, how wonderful if Robert Capper were a Guardian photographer. That would be a very great lineage. But yes, I mean, I think fraud in relation to this, I certainly have feeling fraudulent, just because if you're in a creative profession, you question yourself all the time, and look at other people, and yeah. But I mean, that's part of the joy and the pain of being a photographer. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I think in relation to this, it's because the 20th century certainly has such a fine history of Guardian photojournalism that I wondered whether Sean Smith, with his incredibly impressive 40-year career of covering war, conflict, a lot of social issues, I feel rather a kind of a soft example compared to him to be on the panel. But I'm very honoured to represent the Guardian. Yeah. But there is a long tradition of those sort of floating, slightly abstract moments. That Don McPhee picture actually is a really good example of the kind of Guardian photography sensibility that most appeals to me, which is why it does feel, I've diversified, but the Guardian is my home for as long as they'll have me. And it's that sensibility that's rather hard to put your finger on what it is, but that is what I try and develop in myself, and what I find most appealing in their tradition, and I'm glad to be a part of that tradition. But very, very glad, very proud. I don't know if that answers anything.
I think it definitely does. Any others, Pranvera?
That is it.
That is it. Oh my goodness.
I'll just add that it's really lovely to talk about the show to the Frontline Club's audience, because obviously it's also a very special place. So yeah, it's lovely to be here with the audience of the Frontline Club.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this evening. Thank you, panel, Karen, Luke, Sarah, and a very special thanks to Pranvera, who is the co-founder of the Frontline Club, for organizing the very backbone of these talks and ensuring all comes together on the night. I'd just like to announce that our next talk is actually just around the corner. It's going to be next Thursday, because usually we do these talks once a month on the 2nd of September. And I'm very excited to be featuring a preview from Photo London Fair, which, as we all know, has been postponed like 3 times because of the COVID. So finally, it's birthing, and we're going to have a live art on the global stage. And I personally cannot tell you how delighted I am for this event launching on the 9th of September through the 12th at Somerset House. For me, it's a not to miss event, if nothing, just to raise a glass and have some bubbly. And I'm also delighted that I have the privilege of actually being in 2 of the exhibitions that are featured in the show. But next week, we will have Michael Benson, who is the founder of Photo London, along with Ben Burdett, who is the founder of Atlas Gallery. And we're going to have the Iranian artist Shirin Neshat, who won the Master Photography Award, and one other surprise panelist. So I look forward to seeing you all next Thursday, same time, same hour. And thank you all for coming along tonight, and see you all panel either at Photo London, or we can meet up for a drink anywhere. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Thanks
Very
very
much.
much.